Historical Minnesota story time. When you think about gangland era America, the Al Capones and the John Dillingers, the speakeasies and the bank robbers, Minnesota is rarely the first place to come to mind. But it should be, because there's really no gangland story that's complete without the land of 10,000 lakes. And today's story is the story of Ma Barker. Now, if you've ever watched The Goonies, Ma Fratelli is loosely based on Ma Barker. Ma Barker was born Arizona Donnie Clark in Ash Grove, Missouri in 1873. And she grew up to marry George Barker, of whom she had 4 sons with, who would grow up to become notorious criminal. Her son Herman was arrested in 1910 for highway robbery, because apparently that was still a thing in the 20th century. And Herman would end up meeting his demise after nearly 2 decades of crime in 1927 when he shot himself after getting in a car wreck running from the police, because they ain't taking me back to prison. Ma's other sons ended up being incarcerated for other crimes the following year in 1928. George, at this point, having suffered the loss of one son and the shame of the rest being notorious criminals, decided that he was no longer going to claim his children. However, Ma Barker was a dedicated and loving mother who would help them and care for them no matter what they did. As a result, Ma and George's relationship fell apart in 1928 as well, and this thrust Ma into super hard times. She was unemployed, her husband was gone, her sons were dead or in prison, she was just thrust into abject poverty. From 1928 to 1930, she lived in a dirt floor shack. She eventually entered into a relationship with Arthur Dunlop, who was also an unemployed guy, so her situation didn't improve much. But by 1931, her son, Fred Barker, was released from prison and started up a brand new game with prison mate Alvin Karpus. So they started committing robberies, shooting cops, some real Jesse James shit, and they took Ma and her deadbeat boyfriend along for the ride. It's around this time that a wanted poster came out for old lady Ari Barker, and this is where the legend of Ma Barker was born. And I say legend because that's what it is. The stories you've heard about Ma Barker are not true. So Ma and the gang was in Chicago by 1932 when her son Arthur Barker was released from prison and joined up with them. By this time, the gang in Grand Theft Auto terms had 3, pretty close to 4 stars. So when you're a 1930s gangster and you need a place for the heat to die down, there's only one place for you to go. The place where if you're not careful, an accidental encounter can end in you chasing a southern woman down a big river. St. Paul, Minnesota. But why would all the gangsters run to sleepy St. Paul? Well, it wasn't to confess their sins in our badass cathedral. It's because St. Paul looked at Chicago and New York and saw that they were getting their asses handed to them by all these gangsters, and they decided to go with a different approach. The sheriff let all the gangsters of the country know that he'd make a gentleman's agreement with them. You don't fuck with St. Paul, and St. Paul won't fuck with you. You are all welcome in St. Paul to come and kick back for a while. Enjoy our thriving nightlife and speakeasies, because despite Minnesota being the birthplace of national prohibition, we were still the drunkest state in the country. Feel free to go out to eat, to walk the streets. St. Paul police will not bother you. In fact, we'll even go one step further. We'll go out of our ways to shelter you from the prying eyes of the FBI. Just don't fuck around and don't find out. And this worked great. While every other major or even moderate-sized city was an all-out war with gangs right in the streets, St. Paul was teeming with more gangsters than basically any place else at any given time, and yet had almost no gang crime whatsoever. Because as it turns out, public enemies like to have a place where they can hang out and not have to look over their shoulder. As a result, St. Paul police didn't have to do shit. The gangsters policed themselves. You did not come to St. Paul and cause trouble, and if you did, it wasn't St. Paul police that you had to worry about. So in rolls Ma Barker and the gang, and they make a house on Robert Street in West St. Paul their new base of operations. And because Minneapolis was just a short jaunt across the river and did not share the same gentleman's agreement, they didn't have to go far to start doing crime again. They started off with a robbery, the Third Northwestern Bank of Minneapolis, but then they decided it was time to diversify. Really, add to the portfolio of the organization by means of kidnapping. And they started their diversification with the kidnapping of William Ham Jr. This William Ham Jr. Also, I sell these koozies. Go buy one. Anyway, the kidnapping turned out to be pretty lucrative. They ransomed him for $100,000, which is like almost $2 million in today's money. As their crime spree continued, their notoriety grew, and the media started telling a story. The story of this old lady, Ma Barker, who was helping to plan these crimes. Headlines like Granny Gangster, well, that sells newspapers, and so this legend began to grow. Now, in reality, all the Barkers were idiots. Ma Barker cooked and cleaned and would be the one to rent the safe houses for the gang because she was an unassuming old lady. But accomplice was about the extent of her involvement. She didn't plan anything, and she would go to the movies while the gang went out and committed their crimes. Alvin Karpus was the one running the show. Hell, they even got annoyed with her boyfriend, Arthur, and shot him in the back of the head and dumped his naked body in Webster, Wisconsin. So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say Ma didn't have a whole lot of say in what was going on. Anyway, after the sloppy kidnapping of a bank president, the FBI started nipping on their heels. So the gang split up, and the FBI ended up catching up with Arthur Barker in Chicago. And this led to some evidence that some of the other gang members were hiding out down in Florida. By the time they figured out where their Florida safe house was, Alvin Karpus and some of the other gang members had left a few days earlier, but Fred and Ma Barker remain. So a bunch of cops and agents surround the house with a dude and his elderly mother inside. You know, cops are gonna cop, so they decided the best approach to apprehension was to pose the question of how many bullets it takes to level a house. And after a shootout that took so long spectators came to watch, the brave members of law enforcement gave the handyman who takes care of the property a bulletproof vest and told him to go in and check it out. Anyway, this was like the house version of Bonnie and Clyde, so they were both dead. Obviously. This is where the legend of Ma Barker really gets solidified. See, the FBI was still a pretty young organization at the time, and J. Edgar Hoover, who ran it, was a gigantic piece of shit. And shooting an old lady wasn't the best look PR-wise. So despite having no evidence that Ma Barker ever participated in any of the crimes, no photographs of her with the gang out doing gang things, no fingerprints of hers ever found at a crime scene, nothing that would ever suggest that she was anything more than, you know, somebody who maybe aided and abetted them committing their crimes. I mean, she knew that they were doing it, but she was not doing it with them. Hoover really decided to lean into those gangster granny stories to make the FBI look better. He put in the FBI report that she had a Tommy gun on her, even though there was only one Tommy gun found, and there was none of her fingerprints on it, and it's safe to assume that Fred was probably the one using it. But that FBI report is really what solidified the legend of Ma Barker in popular culture. Fact or fiction, it's a great story, and nonetheless a cool piece of Minnesota history.